Welcome back. We are ready to read Chapter 2 in Gulliver's Travels, and the name of the chapter is I Am Captured. The sun was high in the sky when I awoke. I blinked my eyes. The memory of the storm and my comrade's fate seemed like a bad dream. I remembered where I was and I smiled. I am safe, I said. That is all that matters. No sooner were these words out of my mouth than I heard a faint rustling sound, like the scurrying of small animals in the grass. I thought nothing of it. My first task was to explore this place and find help. I tried to lift my head, but it wouldn't move. What's this? I said. Have I tangled my hair in brambles? I tried to raise my arms to feel my hair, but I couldn't move them either. I tried lifting my legs, but they were also stuck to the ground. I was thoroughly puzzled. I tipped my head forward an inch and turned my eyes down as far as they would go. Good heavens, I exclaimed. I am tied to the ground. I couldn't believe my eyes. My entire body was covered by hundreds of tiny ropes, no thicker than a thread. They were everywhere, crossing my chest and my arms and my legs as if a giant spider had woven me into its web. Each rope was tied to a pin-sized stake that was driven solidly into the ground. My long hair was also tied to the stakes. I laid on my back in the hot sun, unable to move. I was dumbfounded. I am a prisoner, I cried, but who has captured me? I heard the rustling sound again. At the same time, something moved up my leg. I thought a mouse had found me. I wanted to bat it away, but my arm wouldn't budge. The creature walked over my stomach and moved slowly to my chest, where it stopped just below my chin. I took a huge gulp of air, thinking I could blow it away, but when I tipped my eyes again to see what it was, the air rushed out in a gasp. Woof! I exclaimed, this is not possible. Standing in the middle of my chest, staring into my face as if I had just fallen from the sky, was a perfectly formed little man less than 6 inches tall. I blinked 20 times in disbelief, but each time my eyes opened, he was still there. He wore ordinary clothes, and he looked every bit like anyone I had ever seen in London. In his hands was a miniature bow loaded with a tiny arrow smaller than a sewing needle. A quiver filled with more arrows was slung on his back. A little man? I exclaimed. At the sound of my voice, the man raised his bow and pointed it at my nose. At the same time, another ripple of tiny footsteps scampered up my body, and no fewer than 40 more little men forming a rank behind the first. I am dreaming, I shouted as loud as I could, hoping the noise would wake me up. Instead, it rolled like thunder, and the little people ran for their lives, jumping and falling to the ground. The place was silent for many long minutes, and then a murmur rose from the grass. As curiosity got the best of them, the band of the little men cautiously climbed back onto my chest. The first man I had seen was the leader, and he was bolder than the others. He walked up close to my chin and tapped it with the tip of his bow. He peered into my face, and he opened his mouth to speak. He had to shout for me to hear his shrill little voice, but his language was one I had never heard. I can't understand you, I whispered so I wouldn't frighten him. I wanted to face him, so I struggled to break my bonds. I pulled my left arm free and turned my head slightly. The moment I moved, a shout went up, and the little men scattered like a swarm of bees, then immediately regrouped on top of my stomach. At the command from their leader, they shot a shower of tiny arrows at me. The arrows stung my raised hand like needles. Some arrows stuck my body and bounced off of me, but a flight of them flew into my face. Ouch! I cried as I put my hand up to protect my eyes. The more I struggled, the more arrows hit me. They were joined by a series of lances, thrusts that pierced my coat. I knew it would be wiser to lie still. Stop, I said. I give up. The moment I stopped moving, the arrows stopped. I put my head back, relieved that the stinging attack was over. Soon the air was filled with the noise of hammering and sawing. It was mixed with the rustling and the murmuring of the crowd of tiny people gathered around me. I turned my head to see what they were doing. A band of miniature carpenters was hard at work constructing a stage next to my head. When it was finished, an important looking man, attended by three servants, no taller than my index finger, climbed the ladder to the platform at its top. He looked down into my face and he began to talk. He made a long speech that I could not understand, but I judged by the tone of his voice that he was asking me to behave. Oh, yes, I said in a tone that he could understand. The man shouted an order to the people below, and the ropes holding me down were cut. The man spoke again in words that sounded like promises, threats, pity, and kindness. He paused for my reply. I am at your mercy, I said with a smile so he would not mistake my intention. The man nodded. I am very hungry, I said, putting my hand to my mouth as if eating. The great lord shouted to the throng below. In moments, dozens of ladders were placed against my sides, and 100 tiny people carrying baskets filled with food scrambled up them. I learned later that the food was sent by the emperor. I ate heartily. The meat was of whole shoulders and legs of animals, but to me they were as small as birds. I ate one or two or three at a time. The bread loaves were no bigger than a fat pea, and I ate those by the mouthful. I made a sign that I was thirsty, and 2 large barrels were rolled to me. Each one held about half a pint. I easily emptied them in 2 swallows. When I finished my meal, I put my hand to my lips to cover a polite burp. The crowd roared with approval, and those on my chest danced for joy. I was tempted to grab a handful of them, but I had promised not to escape. I was bound by the laws of hospitality that they had showed me. A short time later, a high-ranking person strolled across my chest and stopped a few inches in front of my face. He held up a scroll with the royal sign on it to show that he had been sent by the emperor. I recognize a royal seal when I see one, I said, nodding to be sure that he knew I understood. He turned to the horizon and pointed with a gesture that made it clear I would be taken there. But first you must cut the rest of my bonds, I said, making a sawing sound with my fingers. The man shook his head firmly. I see, I said sadly. I am still your prisoner. I thought of breaking free, but the memory of the stinging arrows and the blisters that they raised changed my mind. My eyes began to flutter, and I drifted into a deep slumber. I was told later that my drink was drugged and that I heard about what happened while I slept. The emperor had ordered 500 carpenters to build a machine large enough to carry me to the capital. It was a long wooden platform on 22 wheels. Strong ropes were tied to my body and slung over the pulleys on top of the foot-high poles. 900 of their strongest men lifted me off the ground and lowered me onto the platform, where I was tied down, still sleeping. 1,500 tiny horses, only 4.5 inches tall, pulled the platform to the capital. The journey took a day and a half. I didn't wake until a curious guard poked his spear up my nose. Achoo, I sneezed, and the blast blew the poor fellow into the air like a feather. I glanced around. We had stopped next to an ancient temple just outside the city gates. The temple was the largest in the kingdom, and even it was no larger than a dining room table. It was determined that I should live here. The emperor was already coming toward me on horseback. After dismounting, the emperor ordered a crew of blacksmiths to attach dozens of tiny chains to my right leg and lock them to the front of the temple. The chains were long enough for me to walk a few steps or to crawl into the temple, which would be my new home. Unfortunately, they were also strong enough to hold me. Other workers cut the bonds holding me to the platform, and I immediately stood up and stretched. The crowd gasped as my shadow covered thousands of them like a dark blanket. I placed my hands on my hip and surveyed the miniature kingdom spread out before me. The country was as tidy as an English garden. Cornfields looked like flower beds, and forests stood no higher than the hedges. The tallest trees were only 7 feet high. The nearby city reminded me of a toy village. It was barely large enough to fill an average town square. The emperor came toward me. He put his hand to his chin and he walked around me just beyond the reach of my chain. He studied me up and down. And when he was satisfied that I was his prisoner, he ordered his chefs to bring me a feast. The emperor was joined by the empress, a number of princesses and princes, and their attendants. Everyone watched in awe as with gusto I emptied 20 carts filled with food and drink. The emperor was a handsome fellow, a little over 6 inches tall. His clothes were rather plain, but the glittering gold jewel encrusted crown on his head left no doubt about his rank. His right hand held a shining 3 inch sword. There was no doubt he would use it if I broke loose. I held back a smile so he would not be offended. You have a beautiful kingdom, Your Excellency, I said in a tone of admiration. The emperor turned his face up to mine and spoke in a shrill voice. I took that reply to mean thank you. After a time, the emperor and his court returned to the capital. I remained behind, chained to the temple wall. A strong troop of my emperor's guards surrounded my feet. Behind them, pushing and shoving for a closer look, was a vast crowd of tiny people. I was as interested in them as they were in me, and for a long time we exchanged silent gazes. As I turned to the opposite side, a group of troublemakers began shooting arrows at me. One arrow struck close to my eye. The colonel of the guard saw what had happened, and he ordered his men to seize the culprits and tie them up. He delivered them to me for punishment. I leaned down and scooped up all 6 in one hand. Now let's see how brave you are, I said. Their faces went blank with horror. They did not understand my words, but my intention was clear. I lifted them high over my head. The terrified men squawked like a nest of chirping birds. I popped 5 of them into my breast pocket, but kept one tightly clenched in my fist. I opened my mouth as wide as I could, and I held him in front of it so that to him the view would be straight down my throat. He squirmed and he screamed, and I took my penknife from my pocket and placed its point on his chest. I smacked my lips as if I were going to eat him. What a tender morsel, I said. The colonel paced nervously at my feet. He winced when he saw my shiny blade move against the man's chest. With a motion as quick as a toad hop, I cut the man's bonds and lowered him gently to the ground. I took the others from my pocket and set them next to the first man. You didn't think I would harm you, did you? I said with a laugh. The colonel breathed a deep sigh of relief as the troublemakers turned on their heels and disappeared into a cloud of dust. The crowd roared its approval at my kindness, and the colonel was very pleased. And that's the end of chapter 2. We'll read chapter 3 in just a little bit.